and ready to go. So thank you all for coming. Good afternoon. My name is Jasmine Jefferson, and I have the pleasure of serving as the project director for Freedom to Prosper, a new campaign dedicated to canceling all student debt. First, I'd like to thank Representative Mark Pocan and Representative Raul Grijalva and the entire Congressional Progressive Caucus for serving as our co-hosts today, and for continuing to be leaders on higher education issues. For many years, the United States invested in young people by providing low-cost or tuition-free college to everyone, willing to work hard and succeed. Over time, this investment was slashed, and instead, students borrow for their own education, convinced it will lead to prosperity and advancement. This new system was a trap. Today, over 44 million Americans are held captive by student debt. Over the past month, Freedom to Prosper has collected over 200 stories of Americans who are burdened by student debt. After reading all these stories, I find it's nearly impossible to capture in words the amount of stress that Americans experience due to their student loan debt. Recent graduates in their 20s are finding that their dream job isn't enough to meet their loan payments from month to month, and seniors are even having their Social Security benefits garnished and choosing which bills to pay month to month because they still owe the federal government thousands of dollars from attending college decades ago. Now is the time to end the student loan trap and give everyone their freedom. Today, we have a very distinguished panel to give you all more insight into the challenges related to student debt. You'll also receive a foundation on the mechanics of how we can cancel student debt in the United States. So, to start our conversation, I would like to introduce Marshall Steinbaum. Marshall is one of the original authors of the report that serves as the basis for this conversation. And if you didn't already on your way in, I recommend please picking up a copy of the macroeconomic effects of canceling student debt. You can get it here. If you're online, then you can also grab it. If you just do a simple Google search of the title. It was done by the Lever Report at Bard College, and you can download it online, like I mentioned. In addition to being a co-author of the Levy Report, Marshall is also a research director and fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, where he researches market power and inequality. He works on tax policy, antitrust and competition policy, and the labor market. He is a co-editor of After Piketty, The Agenda for Economics and Inequality, and his work has appeared in Democracy, Boston Review, Jacobin, and the Journal of Economic Literature, the Industrial and Labor Relations Review, and Pro Market. Steinbaum earned a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. So here is Marshall.
Thanks very much, and thanks for coming. Let me just give a little bit of background about how I got into studying student debt before I speak directly about the report and some other research that we've been doing. I was trained in labor economics, and as a labor economist, you're taught that what you earn in the market is based on how much education you have. And I think that assumption has really guided the federal government's student loan policy and caused people to think that if they take on student debt in order to achieve a higher level of education, then that will pay off in some sense. They will get raises that will enable them to make payments on their student loans. And I think what increasing amount of research in economics has shown is that that assumption is just not correct. It is true that you get more education if you pay for it. You can take on debt to get more education, but it's not necessarily true that that increase in education will mean that you get higher wages. What it means is you can do better than people who don't have an education, but that doesn't actually mean that the student debt is paying for itself. So I think that a lot of policymakers and academics are kind of coming to grips with this idea that the premise on which they based the expansion of the federal student loan system, which has grown enormously in the last 20 years, is just not a correct understanding of the economy. Regarding the Levy Institute report that we wrote, the basic idea behind it is that the federal government has now over 1.5 trillion, or is $1.5 trillion of student debt outstanding. When we wrote the report, it's slightly less than that. It's growing a great deal over time. Of that 1.5 trillion or so, 90+% of it is actually held by the federal government. It's an asset of the federal government, which means that when you make payments on your student debt, there's a servicer, but really they certainly take their cut, but the bankers, so to speak, the people who lended you the money is the U.S. Treasury, and you're paying them back. That's the 90+%, and then the remainder of it is kind of left over from the old way that we used to finance student debt, which is that banks made the loans, or specific student debt lenders made the loans, and they were guaranteed by the federal government, but the bank was the lender. So in the report, what we do is basically say, what would be the effect on the economy if the federal government, first of all, just decided to cancel the student debt that they have outstanding, so nobody would have to make their payments to the government going forward, and then for that smaller piece that is owed to private lenders, that the federal government would make payments on it instead of the current student lenders. So between those two things, it is basically the federalization or nationalization of the outstanding student debt in this country. The macroeconomic effect of that basically boils down to the fact that a huge body of debt that is currently weighing down individuals and households would be transferred to the government, and the government is better able to handle that debt. So in macroeconomic terms, what that means is that when households are freed from the burden of student debt, they're able to spend money and make other decisions that expand the overall economy, because the federal government can borrow for for a lower interest rate, and that is just less constrained by the weight of debts of any kind. And so we kind of pumped that essential scenario into two different macroeconomic models that tell you, based on certain assumptions about how the economy works, they tell you what is the effect on overall output if you make that big transfer of debt from individuals and households to the federal government. And so you can look to see the exact numbers in the report. It's slightly different for the two different models, but something on the order of $100 billion a year of expanded economic output as a result of canceling student debt. So let me just sort of put that finding in context. First of all, often when you hear something like, oh my God, there's $1.5 trillion of student debt outstanding, that would cost a lot of money for the government to cancel all of that. That seems like a big number, but in fact, it's something that the economy can handle. The government in general is very large, and it already has a lot of debt. This would be a large increase in it, but it's something that would actually be good for the economy and not a threat to overall economic well-being in this country. The other thing that I would say, though, is that sort of this is sort of, the report definitely puts to bed the idea that, we can't afford to do this. And, frankly, we've just passed tax cut a couple of months ago that essentially adds basically the same amount of debt to the federal government's balance sheet as canceling all of the student debt in this country would. And, whatever you think about that tax cut, it's something that we've done. So now we know that it's something that you can do without causing, at least as of yet, without causing a debt crisis in this country and a gigantic increase in the interest rates that the federal government has to pay on its outstanding loans. So I would say that sort of validates my personal view is that canceling student debt would be much more expansionary than whatever we get out of that tax bill, but in terms of the debt that it adds to the government's balance sheet, there's really not that much difference in terms of the two scenarios. I would say that, so this sort of talks about like, oh, it's so expensive and, can we afford it? Well, the answer is yes. The debate in higher education policy and in student debt policy is not really about that. It's more about, is this kind of the right, first of all, is student debt a problem? And second of all, even if it is a problem, is kind of canceling all of it really the right approach? Should we be more confined in how we deal with it? And I want to just end by making the case that this kind of comprehensive approach is in fact the right direction, that the kind of concerns that this goes too far or say rewards people who don't deserve to be rewarded, you get that sort of argument, people who've like taken on too much debt, that's their own fault and it's not really our fault, that or being the government, that's not really right. So and this kind of gets back to where I started about how the premise of the student debt crisis is that student debt pays for itself through getting you more education, which in turn gets you higher earnings. What that has caused is a vast expansion of the number of people who have any student debt at all, and also a great diversification of the kind of people who take on student debt. And that has occurred for a few reasons. I mean, one is just obviously that tuition has gone up at a lot of colleges, so if you want to go to college, you used to not have to take on debt or take on a lot less of it because it was just cheaper, and now you have to. At the same time, in order to get a good job, I would argue you now kind of need a college degree or a master's degree or more higher education. And so, whereas, if you think of yourself versus like the equivalent person 20 years ago or 40 years ago in terms of the job that you have and the job that you want, how much education do you need to get that job? A lot more now than before, and it's much more expensive education. And you can see that kind of throughout the student debt problem in that, it's just a much wider set of people and a much more diverse set of people who have student debt. This is a marker. So the point I would want to make about this is that it used to be the case that having student debt was like marked you out as someone who was relatively affluent, because it meant that, first of all, that you went to college or even to graduate school more likely, and probably that you went to some very expensive graduate school like medical school or law school that meant that you would have a good job. That was kind of the profile of somebody who had student debt, say, 30 years ago. Now, that is definitely not true. Student debt actually marks you out as somebody who is relatively less affluent, because only people who come from pretty affluent family backgrounds are able to get through all of the education that you need to get a job in today's economy without going into debt. So that sort of compositional shift in the population of people who have student debt has, is to my mind kind of the most pressing fact about this. This is why you have lots of people in the street saying that they have, a great deal of student debt and it's weighing them down, and the policymakers are like, oh yeah, I don't really believe it because I think that you got an education and, you're whining, or you just wish that you were, that you didn't have to pay for it. That's not the lived experience of most people who have student debt, and I think they're still in the mindset of, the people who have student debt are just people who kind of got a really expensive education or getting paid a great deal, and they kind of wish they just didn't have to pay off this debt, but that's not really our problem. And so I think that kind of recalibration of the student debt problem and really apprehension of who it is who has student debt, how it's a much more diverse group of people and a much wider social phenomenon among younger cohorts than it used to be, I think has to be at the start of any policy debate about what we're going to do about this problem.
Thank you, Marshall. Let me apologize that you were labeled as Jasmine for the entire time. That was Marshall.
Was it flattering to me?
But there's a seat in the front if you would like to come sit down. Not to put you on the spot, but you're welcome. It's not rude. But thank you, Marshall. I really appreciate that conversation. I just want to highlight one thing he said, specifically about the tax breaks that the Republicans just gave. I can be a little more unbiased in my speech, but the Republicans just easily gave $1.5 trillion of tax breaks to, quite frankly, wealthy Americans. And so I have no problem saying that we could easily cancel all student debt if we can give that sort of tax break to people who do not need it, people who are just going to donate that back to themselves. So anyways, moving forward, I appreciate your remarks. We're going to move forward to Julie Morgan, who is a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. Julie most recently served as a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and prior to joining Gates Foundation, she was a senior policy advisor to Senator Elizabeth Warren, where she was responsible for developing and implementing policy proposals on a range of education issues, including student loan refinancing, college affordability, and student loan servicing reform. She previously served as Director of Post-Secondary Access and Success at the Center for American Progress, and she holds a PhD in Higher Education and a JD from Boston College. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me. Thanks for coming out to listen to us. This is great. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how the playing field for student debt has changed over the last couple of years. As Jasmine mentioned, I used to work on the Hill, and I handled student loan issues, and we really tried our best to make changes for students, and it's so interesting to see how it feels like we're in a little bit of a different moment now in terms of the kinds of proposals that we can imagine and the kinds of changes that we can think about. And obviously part of that is about the general political atmosphere in the country right now, but I think some of it is about what we know about student loan debt now that we didn't know before. And I think Marshall hit on some of the points about who has student loan debt, and that's obviously a really big factor here. But we also know more now than we did even 4 or 5 years ago about who's in trouble on their student loan debt. So obviously we've known for a long time that there are about 44 million Americans with student loan debt. But we know more now about who's defaulting and becoming delinquent on their loans. So over, I don't know, probably the last decade, we mostly looked at cohort default rates. So what happened to borrowers in the 1 or 2 years and then extending to 3 years after they left school. And that's pretty much all we knew, and it showed us that there was a lot of problems in the for-profit college sector, some problems in other institutions, but we really had this narrow slice. And it was sort of interesting that in that time period, we sort of fought to get that window from like 2 years to 3 years. And like that was all we were going to look at, is what happened to borrowers in that period of time. But now we have data that shows what happens over a much longer period of time, and it's made the picture look a lot worse. So now we know that 50% of African American borrowers default within about a decade of leaving school. I mean, that's just a number that should like stop us in our tracks, right? And make us think, what are we doing with this student loan system? We also know that for all other borrowers, there's sort of like the window that we tracked. Defaults sort of stay steady, go up, and then as you get outside of that window, they just shoot up. So we're essentially we haven't been looking at where the defaults were happening. But now we know more. And we also know more about how student loan debt is affecting the economy. So we know that it's holding borrowers back from doing the things that we want them to do as a result of having gotten an education. So we want them to be buying homes, starting small businesses, buying things, right? Participating in our economy, and they're not able to do that fully. So it gives us an opportunity to take a look at the system and say, is this working both for the individual borrowers, but also for the overall economic effects that we wanted our higher education system to have, and particularly our federal investment in higher education? The other thing that we know more about, in addition to sort of the borrower reality of it, is why the system is the way it is. And this is something that I've been looking into over the past couple of years. So there's both an economic case for taking steps to alleviate student debt for all borrowers, but there's also a moral case too. And that's basically that the system has been rigged to work for the powerful servicers, lenders, and colleges that have manipulated it for their own benefit. And I think, look, this is the case across a lot of our government, where big businesses are able to sort of march in and use their lobbyists and their money to sort of get what they want, but it's really striking within the student debt system. So I'd give just 2 examples. So one is Navient, the student loan servicer. You guys familiar with Navient? Okay. As far as I can tell, Navient still owes the federal government $22 million. They've owed this money for about a decade. They just refuse to pay it back, right? We have borrowers who, when they owe $1 to the government, we're hitting them up with collections notices, we're garnishing wages, we're garnishing Social Security, but Navient can owe the government $22 million, and we continue to put it's actually more than $100 million a year of taxpayer money into Navient to service student loans. And that's just one example of servicer misconduct that just gets glossed over. Another really good example that I think doesn't get a lot of attention is in 2014, and I was still working on the Hill at the time, the Department of Education announced that they were recalculating cohort default rates. So the cohort default rate serves 2 purposes. One is it tells us generally how many people are in trouble on their student loans, which we've talked about. The window is too small, but But the other thing it does is it's one of the very few accountability measures we have for colleges of whether or not they should be able to participate in the student loan program, right? So if you have a cohort default rate of over a certain amount, the college should lose access to the program. The Department of Education announced that they were recalculating the cohort default rate for certain schools, and their reasoning was something like this. There are borrowers out there who have what they called split servicing. So they had 2 different loans and they were being serviced by 2 different servicers. And the department had figured out that borrowers who have loans that are serviced by 2 different people are much more likely to default. It's just like too confusing. So they'd end up defaulting on one loan but not the other because they thought they were current or whatever. And the department was like, this is just unfair for us to hold colleges accountable when a person defaulted for a reason that was outside of the college's control in terms of the quality of their program. So we took those out of the calculation so that those colleges could stay in the program. But the borrowers, it wasn't their fault either, right? Where the government is basically admitting that it wasn't the borrower's fault, but we let those borrowers default on their loans. We didn't do anything to help them. And the answer is obvious, right? The colleges work very closely with the Department of Education. They hire lobbyists who are in there all the time. They're pushing for their interests, and they're seen as a partner in the program. But for reasons that should be obvious, students and borrowers are not treated that way. And in many ways, they're treated as sort of like a piggy bank for taxpayer profits or for the profits of for-profit colleges. It just starts to take on this flavor that's like, this is supposed to be a program that was here to help people go to college, and it has turned into just sort of like a spigot of federal money into private companies that want a piece of the action. I think what was really striking to me about reviewing some of that history, and Roosevelt put out a paper that kind of gets into even more of these examples, is that Congress and the Department of Education have been willing to let a lot of people off the hook. And when Marshall talks about the argument that we get back on student debt cancellation that, people owe this money and we can't just it's just not right to just let them off the hook. We do that all the time. We just do it for the people who have a voice in government and who have the money to be able to participate. And so our view on this is that we can change that. We can point out those examples and we can give students and borrowers a bigger voice in the conversation and start looking at policy from the perspective of what's best for our economy as a whole and for this generation of borrowers.
Thank you very much, Julie. I appreciate that. So, just to highlight some of what she said, just the breadth of the type of people who are taking out loans just varies. So you mentioned Social Security garnishments, for example, and I mentioned that in my opening remarks. These borrowers are not just young people. So we're not just talking about somebody who's 22 or 23, just left law school and now they have all of this debt. We're not just talking about doctors who might be a little older in their 30s. We're talking about people who are in retirement and they have student loans either because they went to college and have been unable to pay it off, or because they actually took out loans for their children and they're still trying to pay off those loans. So as part of our story collection, there were a ton of parents who wrote in and said, well, my child went to school for this and now she's working doing this, but that thing that she's doing now is not paying off the loan that she took out when she was in college, and now we're stuck thinking about retirement. But we don't know what we're going to do in retirement because we have this loan and can't get rid of it. And as loving parents do, they're not going to just, give the loan away and put it on their child. Parents want to take care of their kids as they have, and kids want to do their best and pay back their loans, but people are put in positions because of bad actors like Navion that you mentioned. And the system is rigged for us to fail, and we should do something about it, and that's why Freedom to Prosper exists, so that we can get rid of all of that loan debt, because it shouldn't exist. And so, to talk a little bit more about what do we do about this now? So we've been presented with a problem. We know what's wrong. We know that our system is not working in its current state. We have Richard Eskow, who is, what is your official title? Policy advisor? Something like that. Senior advisor, sorry. Richard is the senior advisor for Freedom to Prosper. And so in addition to doing all of his work for Freedom to Prosper, he's also a freelance writer and the host of the Zero Zero Hour, which if you haven't checked it out, you should check out the Zero Hour. It's an awesome show. But anyways, he does that weekly radio and TV program. He's also senior advisor for health and economic justice at Social Security Works. He's a former consultant, public policy advisor, and senior executive in the United States and in more than 20 foreign countries. And his writings have appeared in print and digital in a number of publications. So thank you, Richard, for being with us.
Thanks, Jasmine. So, quick question. How many people here have student debt? That's like, what, 80% of the group, probably, which totally is not a surprise. And look, first of all, I think all of us who incurred student debt, and by the way, I did myself, but I was lucky because I got a scholarship to the State University of New York, which at that time, my family was really excited because that was going to save us $250 a semester in tuition, because that's what tuition was if you were an in-state resident. So one of the things that's happened in the last 30, 40 years is that college went from affordable to not affordable. And that includes public as well as private. But when it went from public to not, when it went from affordable to not affordable, we as policymakers, as a community, continued to tell you it was the path to prosperity, and that don't worry, no matter how much you borrow for your education, you're going to make it back in earnings, so it's a good investment. So when Marshall, for example, talks about the fact that economists are beginning to realize that additional education doesn't drive the kind of earnings that they may have assumed it did at one point, well, that gets to a key part of the moral argument we're talking about here, which is everybody who's incurred student debt, or certainly most of the people who've incurred student debt, have incurred it based on a deal or an argument, a kind of unwritten contract that society hasn't kept its bargain of. In other words, we said to close to 44 million people, if you go out and borrow money for student debt, it's a good investment. It'll pay off. Now we're learning that's probably not the case in a lot of examples, and the people most burdened with student debt are the people for whom it's most not the case. So when I first heard about, and by the way, if you guys have comments or questions you want to disagree, I guess we'll have a Q&A afterwards, but you can always interrupt me and say, hey, no, I don't think so. I first heard about this idea 3.5 years ago when I was approached about working on it. And at that time, I was working on a presidential campaign that was doing really well based on the idea that you can propose big things and people will respond to it. And, you know, a lot of people had heard this idea around town here in our shared line of work and had said it's too crazy. It's just too extreme. It's just something that won't catch on. But I had a different reaction, and I've been extremely pleasantly surprised how many policymakers and people in the political world have reacted the same way since then. And that's, no, this is an idea that, first of all, when I first heard it, it kind of jolted my way of thinking. You know, I've worked a lot in writing about economics and policy and doing policy work myself, and I'm used to, you know, double checking and triple checking the numbers, and we got to do that. I'm not disrespecting that, Marshall, but I had gotten out of the habit of connecting with why big ideas, among other things, energize voters, energize activists, even energize those of us who are in this line of work, to really get excited about something and change people's way of thinking. And I'll tell you how it changed my way of thinking as soon as I heard about it. Number one, I thought about this sort of bargain that society had made with 44 million people and how it's been broken. Secondly, I thought about the ways in which previous generations, my mother, who just passed away at the age of 95, my mother went to UC Berkeley and When I asked her how much she paid in tuition, she said we didn't have tuition. We did have a student fee we had to pay, and that covered everything, including medical care and some other things. And I said, how much was it? And she said $25 a year. So, we used to have free education and higher education in this country. And we also went through the debate in this country about whether to have free high school education. That was not always free. We went from 10% of the population, if I remember my statistics correctly, having a high school education in the beginning of the 20th century to by 1940, I think it was more than 50% and well over that now. So I thought about this in the context of those kinds of changes, of the GI Bill, of how every soldier who went away who served in the military was given the chance to get an education. And so I thought about it in those terms, and I thought about the moral case, and I also thought that it was a good way to reaffirm our commitment to one another across lines of generation, across lines of income level and class, across lines of demographics and race and geography, of a way of saying, yeah, we're all in this thing together, and we should not have provided a raw deal to the young people and older people who took on student debt. So that's when I got involved in it, and it's been, I think, about 3.5 years now that I've been working on this, and it's been a great experience in a lot of ways. One of the great experiences was seeing Marshall and the other economists who worked on that project do their work and discover that, as soon as I started going around town with my colleagues and saying, hey, you want to work on this with us? I got a lot of pushback, and I got a lot of progressive pushback. We all did. And one of it was, we can't afford it. That was number one. We can't afford it. It's too much money. Well, obviously, if you're a Republican in this room, God bless you for being here, but I'm going to assume there isn't one. So the Republicans don't feel that kind of worry, right? They give away $1.4 trillion in tax cuts to the wealthy. They don't even think twice about it. But, Democrats tend to be a little more process-oriented. And so everybody said, we can't afford it. Now, I don't want to get into the economic theory of whether we can afford or not afford to take on trillions of new expenditure. But I will say this. The report that these guys, a fine report, I encourage you to take a look at it. There's some outside. It shows that as an overall economy, without this artificial division of public versus private expenditure, we can't afford not to do it. It creates more, depending on the modeling you use, whatever modeling you use that these guys use, well over 1 million jobs. What, per year for several years? What's the total? A bunch of jobs. A bunch of jobs for a bunch of people. And it does so. It does so by doing something that's morally correct. We can afford to do it. That's clear. The bill that's out there now, the one that's being discussed now, is one from Representative Polis, and it's structured by taking back the Trump tax cut and using it for this. You could argue that you don't need to take back from A to do B, but it makes a great point by doing that, which is, if they can think big, we can think big. Okay, that's number one. And number two is, unlike that tax cut, that $1.4 trillion tax cut, which I think most economists would agree is going to have marginal stimulus effects, some, but very marginal given the loss of revenue involved, this would really so those guys here who said you had student debt, if you didn't have to pay back your student debt, could you figure out a way to spend the money? Yeah, I thought so. So that's the point, right? Because household formation, younger people with student debt aren't getting married as early. They're not going out and forming households as early. They're not buying homes as much as previous generations did. Not, I should say you, since most of you fit that cohort, not buying cars, not doing the other things. Restaurant attendance is not what it used to be. I used to have this fantasy that I would go out to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and talk to the Cattle Ranchers Association about why they should sign on to this project so that people would buy more beef. But whatever it is, the point is, it's holding the economy back, number one. But number two, it's morally the right thing to do. So I'm glad you guys are here and showing the interest in it. And I do want to mention one other thing, well, maybe one and a half before I go. One is there is a website. I'm sure Jasmine was going to mention that, but freedomtoprosper.org that will have all this information. And two is we have a really interesting new analysis about to come up, hopefully by Friday. But we're checking and double checking, and I act like I'm very flippant about the numbers and stuff, but we're all poring over everything right now. So we're hoping it'll be up by the end of the week. And I don't know if you guys know the group Data for Progress, Sean McElwee and a couple others, but it's them. And it's going to, they did the work with us, and we had a lot of fun doing it. And it includes polling data. It includes an interactive map. We've figured out a way to calculate a student debt burden score with a lot of input from Marshall here and Julie and others. And so it's going to be an interactive map, unless it's just a little clunky to move it and drag it and drop it, in which case it'll just be a series of tables. We're working on that right now. But it'll be a map. And it will include the student debt burden score by state and district. So your electeds, I think, will be really interested in it because it'll show what student debt is doing in their district. Hopefully it'll show the number of people affected. And it will also, there'll be a memo on the political case for canceling student debt. And there will be some truths, as we call it, about student debt. Some of the things that Marshall and Julia were talking about, the misconceptions about what student debt is. And at some point, we're also going to add in, I compiled a list of all the arguments we've gotten of why we shouldn't do this and what the answers are. Because we've gotten a lot of, it would, you get the moral hazard argument, for example, that Julie alluded to, which is, they took on this debt, you took on this debt, and if you're one of the folks who did, and, by gosh, we should pay, if you take on a debt, you should pay it back. Well, if you buy a used car and they rolled the odometer back, you're not expected to pay full price for it, right? So, that's the principle here. If you take on student debt based on a social contract, society told you something about the cost of that debt that wasn't true, you should be able, we should reconsider that debt. And as Julie said, a lot of those people making those arguments, they walk away from debt every day. They do it for a living, from the president on down, I would say. And my favorite story, by the way, in that regard was during the mortgage foreclosure crisis, when the head of the Mortgage Bankers Association was going around saying it would be morally reprehensible to allow homeowners to get relief on their home loans because they made a commitment and they need to stick with it. At the same time, the Mortgage Bankers Association had defaulted on the loans it took to build a new headquarters here in D.C., which was about $35 million. So, it's standard operating practice for some people to walk away from debts because circumstances change. And that's part of what we're doing here. So, that's it. I guess that's really all I've got to say. I'll probably, even after all these years of talking, I'll probably sit down and think, I should have said that, but I can't think of it right now. So I guess you tell us what we're supposed to do next, Jasmine. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So we have about 20 minutes left, and I first first wanted to note that, and in his absence, give credit to Bo Morris, who is going to come speak on this panel. He works for Representative Jared Polis, who, as Richard mentioned, introduced a bill that did cancel student debt. It was called the Students Over Special Interests Act. And so that piece of legislation was an example that this could be real. You can, in fact, introduce legislation that cancels student debt. And I encourage you all to start researching this, start, as Richard mentioned, going on our website, going to freedomtoprosper.org, looking up what we have to say, and then also going to other great resources like the Lever Report to look at the mechanics of this topic. One of the other things that Richard mentioned that I think is important is this is a big idea, and it's okay that it's a big idea. We want Medicare for all. We want to expand Social Security. We want to cancel student debt, and that's okay. We should be thinking big because Republicans do big things all the time without even thinking twice about it. And so we can think big too, and we can do these things and not think twice about it because the things we're thinking about doing are going to help Americans. We're going to reinvest in Americans and make sure that we are growing, our economy is growing bigger than it ever has before. You mentioned the jobs. I think it's 1.4 million jobs that canceling student debt would create. There's so many people who write about, you mentioned not getting married. There was someone who said they are not getting married because they would have to change how much their income, because they will be making too much to qualify for income-based loan repayment. They will not get married because of their student debt. There are people who will not have children because of their student debt. And that's not a society that we should be living in. People cannot afford medicines because of student debt. That's unfair, and we can do something about it. And so that, again, is why Freedom to Prosper exists right now. And I hope that you all will take the time to look into what we're doing and look into how you all can be a part of that. But I will not take advantage of the mic, and I would like for you all to have an opportunity to ask questions to whomever you'd like on the panel. And so I will open up the floor, and whoever would like to ask whatever they want to ask, relevant to the topic, of course. Yes.
So you spoke a lot about canceling. I'm Virginia. I work for Congressman Charlie Crist from Florida. You spoke a lot about canceling existing debt. Going forward, what is your just thoughts or proposals about how students pay for college in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm sorry I didn't address it going forward. It's kind of an assumption of this project that it's kind of a sister campaign to the campaign for free tuition-free public higher education. And by the way, I'm also for some kind of additional assistance like Germany offers, living expense assistance and things like that. That's where I am personally, but it's kind of an assumption going forward that society is moving in that direction now, that the momentum is with restoring the kind of free higher education that previous generations enjoyed. So we kind of think of the 44 million and growing, unfortunately, as the sort of in-betweener generation caught between those two eras. And so people have taken on that struggle and that campaign, and we're glad they have. So that's not our space with this, but we assume they go together.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes, very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Can I say also on that point? So I think that's right. I would just give a pitch too, since you all get to sit around and think about policy ideas all day. That even in the event where we have free college and we are able to cancel existing student debt, the private student loan market exists and probably will always exist, and so we still need to be thinking about what are the things that we can do to regulate predatory student lending going forward.
Okay. Anyone else have any burning?
I'm Zach. I work for Congressman Brendan Boyle. I was curious if you could speak to some of the progressive pushback that you received when you were working on a campaign presenting this idea, and if you've seen more progressives latch onto the idea, or if the pushback still exists.
Yeah, that's a great question, Zach. Well, when we first started talking about it around town, we got a lot of, not a lot, but we got a fair amount of, well, it's a little too far. We want some interest rate relief and some other policy, trimming the sails here and there on the current policies. And then we got a kind of pushback that said that this was something that would primarily help wealthy white professionals and not therefore be perhaps regressive economically. But I think one of the things we found through not only the Levy report but other research that Marshall and others have done, that and some of that is on our website now, more of it will be on when we put the new stuff on. I think what we found is that that's not at all the case. So that and there have been a number of reports in the intervening 3 years or so that have buttressed that, that have reinforced that. So I think both those lines of argument have gone away. I think we had more, I don't want to get into the whole PAYGO conversation too much. I think we had more of a emphasis on how do we pay for it from a federal budgeting point of view. I think we've got more people saying now maybe we should be bolder with our ideas and less, and again, I don't want to go down that path right now, but I think that line of pushback has diminished quite a bit. And I think in general, the progressive movement over the last 3.5 years, both in electoral terms and in sort of movement activism terms, has gotten a lot more comfortable with big ideas and with addressing fundamental structural injustices. So I don't see, so in terms of other groups picking it up, there are other groups that are talking about it. There are student groups doing this kind of thing, but there hasn't been in my mind, an organizational framework up to now. So I think that's what this organization is seeking to provide. And I don't know if you guys have anything you want to add to that, or
just one thing, and that this sort of picks up where Richard left off discussing the maps in his remarks. I worked on a project called Mapping Student Debt, which can be seen at mappingstudentdebt.org. That, as the title suggests, was about locating in the American geography where student debt and also student debt delinquency is. And I think that when those things were published a couple of years ago, and now there's going to be some new maps coming out in addition to the ones that Richard mentioned, that was very shocking to a lot of people who had assumed that student debt basically was a problem of the upper middle class and affluent people. When you see where the student debt is and where the delinquency is, that is definitely not the case. So I think, I can just say in the conversations that I had with kind of older experts, they were just kind of had the rug kind of pulled out from under them by the publication of those maps in terms of, who really the student debt crisis is affecting.
Any more questions? It's okay if they're not, that's fine. Okay, so just to close, I wanted to thank our panelists for being here. I really appreciate you all taking the time, and I appreciate all of you for taking the time to come out and just come learn about this new idea. Freedom to Prosper is really in its infancy in DC. We're just starting to create materials and to have a website and to create maps and to do more research on this issue. And so if you find that you go back to either your bosses or your boss's boss and they want more specific information about a specific topic, you can let us know and we will find out the answer. And so on that note, I do not have Freedom to Prosper cards, but my email address is jjefferson@freedomtoprosper.org. You are more than welcome to email me and get in contact with me about whatever it is related to Freedom to Prosper. Like I said, we'd be more than happy to find the answers to whatever it is you're looking for related to this. Obviously, we have access to a breadth of resources and would love to learn more so that you all can learn more about this and so that we can be the most effective movement that we can. Something else we're getting into is actually organizing and working with other student groups so that students can be involved in this. And so I recommend if you are a student or if you know some student groups who are interested that you also go to the website, sign up for our email list and start getting plugged into those sorts of things because we'd love to be involved with you in that way as well. So I think, yeah, it's 2:50. I don't mind ending things early. That's great for everyone's schedule. So I appreciate you all for being here and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.